Unbroken Wings, Unbreakable Courage, the incredible story of United Airlines Flight 232. It was Saturday afternoon, July 19th, 1989. The summer sky over the American Midwest was calm. Passengers aboard United Airlines Flight 232 had settled into what they believed would be another routine cross-country flight. The aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, had departed from Denver and was bound for Chicago before continuing to Philadelphia. There were 285 passengers and 11 crew members on board. Families were returning from vacations. Business travelers reviewed paperwork. Children stared out the windows, fascinated by the endless fields thousands of feet below. Nothing felt unusual. The engines hummed steadily. Flight attendants served drinks and snacks. The cockpit was quiet. Captain Alfred Haynes, First Officer William Records, and Flight Engineer Dudley Dvorak had flown together countless times. They had no reason to believe that within moments they would face one of the greatest aviation emergencies ever recorded. At exactly 3:16 p.m., everything changed. Without warning, a tremendous explosion echoed through the aircraft. Passengers described it as sounding like a bomb. The airplane shuddered violently. Coffee spilled across tray tables. Luggage shifted inside overhead bins. For a brief moment, everyone waited for the shaking to stop. It didn't. Inside the cockpit, warning lights illuminated almost instantly. The crew quickly discovered that the aircraft had suffered an uncontained failure of its tail-mounted engine. But the explosion itself wasn't the greatest danger. The real problem was something almost unimaginable. The debris had severed all three independent hydraulic systems. Modern airliners are built with redundancy. If one hydraulic system fails, another takes over. If that one fails, a third is available. Engineers believed losing all three systems at once was practically impossible, yet somehow the impossible had happened. Within seconds, the pilots realized they had almost no normal control over the airplane. The control column barely responded. The rudder pedals felt useless. The aircraft began rolling slowly to the right. Captain Haynes tried correcting the turn. Nothing happened. The airplane no longer obeyed its pilots. 37,000 feet above the ground, they were flying an aircraft that could no longer be flown. Air traffic control immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. The crew declared an emergency. Controllers searched for the nearest suitable airport. Sioux Gateway Airport in Sioux City, Iowa quickly became the best option, but reaching it would require something no airline crew had ever successfully attempted: flying a large passenger jet without functioning flight controls. As the aircraft drifted across the sky, another pilot happened to be sitting in the passenger cabin. His name was Dennis Fitch. He was a United Airlines DC-10 training captain traveling as a passenger. When he learned about the emergency, he quietly approached the cockpit. He didn't arrive to take command. He arrived to help. The cockpit suddenly contained 4 experienced aviators working together. Each contributed different knowledge. No one argued over authority. No one wasted time assigning blame. There was only one goal: save as many lives as possible. The crew soon discovered something remarkable. Although they had lost nearly all conventional controls, they could still influence the airplane by adjusting engine power. Increasing thrust on one engine caused the aircraft to turn. Reducing power on the other changed its direction. It was crude, imprecise, and incredibly difficult. Imagine trying to steer a car using only the accelerator. That was essentially what they were attempting. Every turn required careful coordination. Every correction took precious time. The airplane refused to fly straight. It slowly oscillated from side to side. Each movement threatened to grow worse. Yet somehow, the crew gradually guided it towards Sioux City. Inside the cabin, flight attendants prepared passengers for an emergency landing. Their voices remained calm. Instructions were repeated carefully. Seat belts tightened. Loose objects were secured. Many passengers wrote final notes to loved ones. Others held hands with complete strangers. Some prayed quietly. Children asked innocent questions their parents struggled to answer. Despite the uncertainty, panic never fully took over. The calm professionalism of the crew gave people something desperately needed: hope. Meanwhile, emergency responders in Sioux City prepared for the unimaginable. Firefighters positioned their vehicles along the runway. Ambulances lined nearby roads. Doctors and nurses stood ready inside local hospitals. Hundreds of first responders waited, knowing they might soon face one of the largest aviation disasters in American history. Back in the cockpit, the runway finally appeared, but the aircraft was descending too quickly. It was moving too fast. The damaged airplane continued banking slightly to the right. The crew fought every second to stabilize it. Captain Haynes later admitted they knew one thing for certain: they were not going to make a perfect landing. The only question was whether they could make a survivable one. At approximately 4:00 p.m., United Flight 232 reached the runway. The right wing touched first. Almost immediately, the aircraft began breaking apart. It spun violently. Sections separated across the runway. A massive fire erupted as fuel ignited. Emergency crews rushed forward within seconds. Smoke covered much of the scene. Yet something extraordinary happened. People began walking out. Passengers helped one another escape. Flight attendants guided survivors through openings in the damaged fuselage. Firefighters reached trapped passengers with incredible speed. Doctors treated the injured directly beside the runway. Against nearly every expectation, many had survived. When rescue operations ended, 185 people were alive. 111 people had tragically lost their lives. Every loss was heartbreaking. Yet aviation experts agreed on one remarkable fact. Considering the complete loss of flight controls and the severity of the crash, few believed anyone could survive. The number of survivors, astonished investigators. In the weeks that followed, investigators searched for answers. They recovered the failed engine. Inside it, they discovered an almost invisible defect, a tiny microscopic flaw in a titanium fan disc. The crack had existed since manufacturing years earlier. It slowly grew over thousands of flights until the metal finally failed. The engine explosion itself was catastrophic, but investigators also learned another important lesson. The aircraft's hydraulic lines, though separated for redundancy, remained vulnerable to damage from the same engine failure. No one had anticipated that a single event could disable every backup simultaneously. The accident changed aviation forever. Aircraft designs were reviewed. Inspection methods improved dramatically. Manufacturing standards became even stricter. Engine components underwent more advanced testing. Pilots began receiving additional training for situations once considered impossible. Perhaps the greatest lesson, however, wasn't about engineering. It was about people. Captain Haynes never called himself a hero. He repeatedly praised his crew. He credited first officer records. Flight engineer Dvorak, training Captain Dennis Fitch, the flight attendants, the firefighters, doctors, nurses, rescue workers. He believed survival wasn't the result of one extraordinary individual. It was the result of hundreds of ordinary people working together under unimaginable pressure. Years later, Captain Haynes reflected on that day with remarkable humility. He often reminded audiences that aviation safety is built not on perfection, but on learning. Every accident, every investigation, every difficult lesson makes future flights safer. Today, United Airlines Flight 232 remains one of the most studied emergencies in aviation history, not simply because of the tragedy, but because it demonstrated what skill, teamwork, preparation, and courage can accomplish when hope seems almost impossible. The aircraft was broken. Its controls were gone. Its chances of survival appeared almost non-existent. Yet hundreds of people walked away because a crew refused to surrender to the impossible. Sometimes history remembers disasters. Sometimes it remembers miracles. And on a summer afternoon in 1989, thousands of feet above the American Midwest, the people aboard Flight 232 proved that even when technology fails, human courage can still make the difference between despair and survival. America's Deadliest Prison Riot, the story of the 1980 New Mexico State Penitentiary riot. It was just after midnight, February 2nd, 1980. Outside, the desert air of New Mexico was cold and silent. The stars hung over the empty landscape, and the walls of the New Mexico State Penitentiary stood like a fortress against the darkness. Inside those walls, more than 1,000 inmates were asleep. Correctional officers quietly walked their overnight rounds. Everything appeared routine. But beneath the silence, anger had been growing for years. Overcrowded cells, poor sanitation, violence between inmates, drug trafficking, weak security, and a prison system that many believed had already lost control. No one realized that before sunrise, this prison would become the scene of one of the deadliest prison riots in American history. The New Mexico State Penitentiary was never designed to hold so many people. Originally built to house far fewer inmates, it had gradually become overcrowded. Cells meant for one prisoner often held two or even three. Resources were stretched thin. Guards struggled to maintain order. Many inmates complained about living conditions, while prison officials faced constant staffing shortages. Tension wasn't hidden, it was part of everyday life. Many correctional officers later admitted they knew the atmosphere inside the prison had become increasingly dangerous. The only question was when something would finally happen. That answer came shortly after 1 a.m. A small group of inmates overpowered a correctional officer in one section of the prison. Using stolen keys, they quickly unlocked gates leading to other housing units. Within minutes, hundreds of inmates were moving freely through areas that should never have been accessible. Alarms sounded. Some officers managed to escape. Others barricaded themselves inside secure control rooms. Outside the prison, state police received emergency calls unlike anything they had heard before. A prison riot had begun, but no one yet understood how quickly it would spread. Inside the facility, order disappeared almost instantly. Groups of inmates rushed through corridors. Some attempted to flee restricted areas. Others began setting fires. Smoke filled sections of the prison. Windows shattered. Metal doors echoed through the buildings. Years of frustration, fear, and anger erupted all at once. Not every inmate joined the violence. Many desperately searched for places to hide. Some locked themselves inside cells for protection. Others pleaded with fellow prisoners simply to let them survive until help arrived. The prison had become completely unpredictable. Outside, law enforcement officers established a perimeter around the prison. No one wanted armed officers rushing inside without understanding the situation. Hostages were believed to be inside. Communication with prison officials was limited. Every decision carried enormous risk. Helicopters circled overhead. Emergency vehicles lined the roads. Throughout the night, state officials struggled to understand what was happening behind the prison walls. Rumors spread quickly. Some reports exaggerated the situation. Others underestimated it. The truth was difficult to determine. As dawn approached, smoke continued rising above the prison. Television crews began arriving. News helicopters captured dramatic images from above. Residents across New Mexico woke to shocking headlines. One of the state's largest prisons had fallen completely out of control. Inside, the destruction continued. Entire sections of the prison suffered severe damage. Offices were destroyed. Records were burned. Equipment was smashed. The prison that had been built to contain danger had itself become dangerous. For correctional officials waiting outside, the uncertainty was overwhelming. They knew lives were at risk, but they also knew that rushing in without a coordinated plan could make the situation even worse. Negotiation became the only realistic option. Hour after hour, officials communicated with inmate representatives. The prisoners demanded safer conditions, improvements to overcrowding, better treatment, and major reforms within the prison system. Some demands reflected years of documented complaints. Others emerged from the chaos itself. Negotiations moved slowly. Every conversation bought valuable time. Eventually, the violence began to decrease. Fatigue replaced adrenaline. Many inmates realized that the prison remained completely surrounded. Escape was impossible. The only path forward was surrender. By late morning, the riot was finally coming under control. Correctional officers and tactical teams cautiously re-entered the prison. What they discovered stunned everyone. Large sections of the facility had been devastated. Buildings were heavily damaged. Fires had blackened walls and ceilings. Corridors were littered with debris. The prison looked less like a correctional institution and more like the aftermath of a natural disaster. When investigators completed their assessment, the scale of the tragedy became clear. 33 inmates had lost their lives. More than 200 others had been injured. Several correctional officers also suffered injuries during the uprising. It remains one of the deadliest prison riots in the history of the United States. The event shocked the nation, but as investigators dug deeper, they found that the riot itself was only part of the story. Years of overcrowding, poor management, insufficient staffing, and deteriorating prison conditions had created an environment where violence could grow unchecked. The riot did not emerge from a single moment. It was the result of many unresolved problems building over time. Independent investigations followed. Government commissions examined nearly every aspect of the prison system. Their reports identified serious failures in security, inmate supervision, facility design, and emergency planning. The findings were uncomfortable, but they were impossible to ignore. The tragedy forced New Mexico to rethink how its prisons operated. Reforms gradually followed. Security systems were upgraded. Training for correctional officers improved. Emergency response procedures became more detailed. Prison management practices were reevaluated. The goal was simple: prevent another disaster like this from ever happening again. Today, the events of February 2nd, 1980 are still studied in correctional academies and criminal justice programs, not because of the violence alone, but because they demonstrate what can happen when long-standing institutional problems remain unresolved. Experts often describe the riot as a warning, a reminder that prisons are complex systems where security depends not only on walls and locks, but also on leadership, staffing, maintenance, communication, and humane management. Ignoring those foundations can allow tension to grow until it reaches a breaking point. More than 4 decades have passed. The prison has changed. Policies have changed. Generations of correctional officers have come and gone, but the lessons remain. History often remembers dramatic moments, yet behind nearly every major disaster lies a much quieter story. Small problems left unsolved, warnings that went unnoticed, and opportunities that were missed. On that cold February night in 1980, the walls of the New Mexico State Penitentiary did not simply contain a riot. They revealed the consequences of years of neglect. It was a tragedy that reshaped prison reform discussions across the United States. And today, It remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of the American correctional system, because sometimes the most dangerous place is not where violence suddenly appears. It is where warning signs have been ignored for far too long. The Impossible Return. The story of Apollo 13. It was April 11th, 1970. A giant Saturn V rocket stood on the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center, ready to carry 3 men farther from Earth than almost anyone could imagine. Their names were Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. Their mission was Apollo 13. The plan was simple in words, but almost impossible in reality. Fly to the moon, land on the lunar surface, collect samples, return safely to Earth. By 1970, the world had already watched Apollo 11 make history. Humanity had stepped on to another world. The impossible had become real. So when Apollo 13 prepared for launch, public excitement was lower than before. To many people, going to the moon had already become familiar, almost routine. But space is never routine. And Apollo 13 would soon remind the world that between Earth and the moon, there is no safe place to stop. The launch was powerful and beautiful. Flames exploded beneath the rocket. The ground shook. Slowly, the Saturn V lifted into the sky. Inside the spacecraft, the astronauts felt the force pushing them back into their seats as Earth fell away beneath them. Everything looked normal. The spacecraft reached orbit. Then it left Earth behind and began the long journey toward the moon. For the first 2 days, the mission seemed almost ordinary. The astronauts checked equipment, performed broadcasts, and monitored systems. Back on Earth, Mission Control in Houston watched every number carefully. Oxygen, power, pressure, temperature. Every reading mattered. Apollo 13 was more than a spacecraft. It was a tiny world, a metal shelter carrying 3 human beings through the darkness of space. Then came the moment that changed everything. On April 13th, more than 200,000 miles from Earth, Mission Control asked the crew to stir the oxygen tanks. It was a normal procedure. A simple switch, something they had done before. Jack Swigert reached forward and activated the system. Seconds later, there was a loud bang. The spacecraft shook. Warning lights flashed. Power began dropping. Oxygen pressure started falling. Inside the command module, the astronauts looked at their instruments in disbelief. Something was terribly wrong. Then came the calm voice that would become one of the most famous lines in space history. "Houston, we've had a problem." At first, no one fully understood what had happened, but within minutes, the truth became terrifying. One oxygen tank had exploded. Another was leaking. The command module, which was supposed to bring them home, was dying. Without oxygen, fuel cells could not produce power. Without power, the spacecraft could not function. And without a functioning spacecraft, 3 men would be trapped in space. The moon landing was immediately canceled. There would be no footsteps, no flag, no samples. Only one goal remained: bring the crew home alive. Mission Control faced a problem unlike anything they had ever seen. The astronauts were too far from Earth to simply turn around quickly. They needed to use the moon's gravity to swing around and head back home, but to survive long enough, they had to shut down the command module and move into the lunar module. The lunar module was designed to land 2 men on the moon for a short time. It was not designed to keep 3 men alive for days, but now it became their lifeboat. Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert powered down the command module and moved into the small lunar module, Aquarius. It was cramped, cold, and never meant for this. But it was alive, and that was enough. Back on Earth, Mission Control became the center of a desperate rescue effort. Engineers, scientists, flight controllers, and astronauts worked without rest. They had to solve problems that had never been solved before. How could they save power? How could they conserve water? How could they remove carbon dioxide from the cabin? How could they navigate without normal systems? Every answer had to work perfectly. There was no second chance. Inside the spacecraft, conditions grew worse. The temperature dropped. The astronauts barely slept. Water was rationed. Food became difficult to eat. Moisture collected on the walls. Their breath filled the tiny cabin, and slowly, carbon dioxide levels began rising. The filters in the lunar module were not enough for 3 men. The command module had extra filters, but they were a different shape. The famous problem became simple and terrifying. They had to make a square filter fit into a round opening. Engineers on Earth gathered the same materials the astronauts had on board: plastic bags, cardboard, tape, hoses. They built a temporary solution on the ground, then carefully read the instructions up to the crew. The astronauts followed each step. Piece by piece, they built the device. It looked rough, improvised, almost impossible to trust, but it worked. Carbon dioxide levels began to fall. The crew could breathe safely again. Still, they were not home. Apollo 13 had to correct its path. If the spacecraft entered Earth's atmosphere at the wrong angle, it could burn up or skip off the atmosphere and drift back into space. Normally, computers and guidance systems would help, but power was limited, so Jim Lovell used something far older: his eyes. He lined up the Earth in the spacecraft window and used it as a guide. The engine burn had to be precise. Too long, and they would miss. Too short, and they would miss. The crew fired the lunar module engine. Mission Control waited. Then the numbers came back. The course correction had worked. They were heading home. As the spacecraft approached Earth, one final challenge remained. The command module had been shut down for days. It had become cold and damp. No one knew for certain whether it would wake up. The crew had to leave the lunar module, return to the command module, and restart it using very limited power. If the systems failed, they would not survive re-entry. Slowly, carefully, they followed the new procedures created by engineers on Earth. Switch by switch, button by button. The command module came back to life, not perfectly, but enough. The crew separated from the service module and saw the damage for the first time. A whole side of the spacecraft had been blown open. The astronauts stared quietly. Only then did they fully understand how close they had come to never returning. Finally, they said goodbye to Aquarius, the lunar module that had saved their lives. It drifted away, its job complete. On April 17, 1970, Apollo 13 entered Earth's atmosphere. For several minutes, radio communication went silent. This blackout was normal during re-entry, but this time it felt endless. Families waited. Mission control waited. The world waited. No one spoke much. Everyone listened. Then a voice returned. The parachutes had opened. Apollo 13 was alive. The command module splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. Rescue helicopters raced toward it. The hatch opened. One by one, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes came out, weak, exhausted, but alive. The mission had failed to land on the moon, but it had achieved something greater. It had brought 3 men home from the edge of disaster. Apollo 13 became known as a successful failure, a mission that failed its original goal, but succeeded in the most important mission of all, survival. It showed the world the power of teamwork, training, calm thinking, and human creativity under impossible pressure. The astronauts survived because they stayed focused. Mission control succeeded because hundreds of people refused to give up. Every problem became a puzzle. Every minute became precious. Every small decision mattered. Today, Apollo 13 remains one of the greatest rescue stories in human history. Not because everything went right, but because almost everything went wrong, and people still found a way. 3 men were trapped in space. Their spacecraft was broken. Their supplies were limited. Their future was uncertain. But between the cold darkness of the moon and the blue glow of Earth, human courage carried them home. And that is why Apollo 13 is remembered not as a disaster, but as one of humanity's most impossible returns. The company that vanished overnight, the rise and fall of Enron. It was the late 1990s. America was booming. The internet was transforming the world. The stock market seemed unstoppable. Every week, investors searched for the next company that promised to change the future. One name appeared everywhere: Enron. It wasn't just another corporation. It was called the most innovative company in America. Business magazines praised it. Wall Street admired it. University graduates dreamed of working there. Investors poured billions of dollars into its stock. At its peak, Enron was worth more than $70 billion. It looked unstoppable, but behind the glass offices, the smiling executives, and the soaring stock price, a secret was quietly growing, a secret that would eventually erase billions of dollars, destroy thousands of careers, and become one of the greatest corporate scandals in history. Enron was originally an energy company. It transported natural gas through thousands of miles of pipelines across the United States. For years, the business was stable, reliable, predictable. But during the 1990s, everything began to change. The energy market was becoming more competitive. Instead of simply transporting gas, Enron wanted to become something much bigger. Its leaders dreamed of creating a company that could trade energy the same way Wall Street traded stocks, electricity, natural gas, even weather. If it could be bought or sold, Enron wanted to build a market for it. At first, the idea worked. Investors loved innovation, profits appeared to rise. The company's stock price climbed year after year. Employees watched their retirement accounts grow. Many believed they had found the perfect company. Inside Enron's headquarters in Houston, success became part of the culture. Executives encouraged employees to think bigger, take risks, beat competitors. Winning became everything. The company recruited some of the brightest graduates from top universities. People worked long hours chasing enormous deals every quarter. Wall Street expected higher profits every quarter. Enron promised even more growth, but there was one problem. Real business doesn't always grow that quickly. Sometimes projects fail. Sometimes markets slow down. Sometimes companies lose money. Most businesses report those losses honestly. Enron chose a different path. Instead of showing disappointing results, the company began using aggressive accounting methods that made its financial performance appear much stronger than it really was. One of the most controversial practices involved recording estimated future profits immediately, even before those profits were actually earned. On paper, the numbers looked extraordinary. Investors saw success. Analysts recommended buying more shares. The stock price continued climbing, but inside the company, many employees had no idea that the financial picture being presented to the public was becoming increasingly disconnected from reality. To hide debt and financial losses, Enron also relied on a network of complex partnerships and special-purpose entities. These structures were legal in some circumstances, but investigators later concluded they had been used in misleading ways that obscured the company's true financial condition. The arrangements were so complicated that many investors and even some employees struggled to understand them. Each new report looked impressive. Each quarterly announcement reassured the market. Each rising stock price made people believe everything was under control. The illusion grew stronger, but illusions cannot last forever. Among the few people who began asking difficult questions was an internal executive named Sharon Watkins. She noticed irregularities inside the company's financial reporting. The numbers didn't seem to match reality. Concerned about what she was seeing, she warned senior leadership that the company faced serious risks if the problems were not addressed. Her concerns did not immediately change the company's direction. Outside the company, financial journalists also started asking questions. Independent analysts noticed that some of Enron's business structures were unusually difficult to understand. Investors wanted answers. Executives continued offering reassurance. For a while, the market believed them. Then, everything began to unravel. In late 2001, Enron announced that it would revise several years of financial statements. Losses that had been hidden suddenly became visible. Billions of dollars in debt emerged. Confidence disappeared almost overnight. Investors who had once rushed to buy Enron stock now rushed to sell it. The share price collapsed. Only months earlier, one share had traded for more than $90. Soon, it was worth less than $1. The collapse was breathtaking. One of America's largest corporations was falling apart in real time. But the greatest tragedy wasn't measured only in dollars. It was measured in lives. Thousands of employees had invested much of their retirement savings in Enron stock. Many genuinely believed they were investing in the company they helped build. As the share price collapsed, their retirement accounts collapsed with it. People who had spent years working for Enron suddenly discovered that decades of savings had nearly disappeared. Some lost plans to retire. Others lost college funds. Many lost both their jobs and their investments at the same time. Families who once believed they had financial security faced an uncertain future. The company they trusted had vanished almost overnight. In December 2001, Enron filed for bankruptcy. At the time, it was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. Employees packed their belongings into boxes. Office lights turned off. Buildings that had symbolized success suddenly stood almost empty. The collapse sent shockwaves through Wall Street. People asked the same question: how could a company praised by experts, audited by professionals, and admired around the world fall so quickly? Government investigations soon began. Lawmakers held public hearings. Financial records were examined in detail. Executives were questioned under oath. Investigators concluded that misleading accounting practices, hidden debt, conflicts of interest, and failures in corporate oversight had all contributed to the collapse. The scandal also drew attention to the role of Enron's external auditor, whose work came under intense scrutiny during the investigations. The consequences extended far beyond one company. Public confidence in corporate reporting was shaken. Investors demanded stronger protections. The scandal led to sweeping reforms in corporate governance and financial reporting. In 2002, the United States passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, strengthening requirements for financial disclosures, executive accountability, and internal controls. Companies faced stricter auditing standards. Corporate boards assumed greater responsibility. Financial transparency became a far more serious obligation. The lessons of Enron reshaped how major public companies operate. Years later, business schools around the world continued teaching the Enron story, not as a story of innovation, but as a warning. Students studied how pressure to satisfy investors can tempt organizations to ignore ethical boundaries. They learned that impressive numbers mean little if they cannot be trusted, and they discovered that reputation, built over decades, can disappear in weeks. Today, the Enron logo survives mostly in history books and documentaries. The skyscrapers have different tenants. The stock certificates are worthless. But the lessons remain, because Enron wasn't simply the story of one company. It was the story of what can happen when appearances become more important than honesty, when short-term success is valued more than long-term trust, when complicated financial engineering hides simple truths. History often remembers dramatic disasters, airplane crashes, explosions, natural catastrophes, but sometimes the most devastating collapse makes almost no sound at all. No fire, no smoke, no collapsing buildings, only computer screens where numbers quietly fall until billions of dollars disappear. And in those falling numbers, thousands of ordinary people watched their savings, careers, and dreams vanish. Enron had promised to build the future. Instead, it became one of history's clearest reminders that no company is too big to fail, and no success is sustainable if it is built on a foundation that cannot support the truth. The Last Letter, an original mystery story. Every town has a story that people whisper about, a story no one can fully explain. In the quiet town of Ashwood, that story began with a single letter. Not an email, not a text message, a handwritten letter. One that arrived 30 years too late. On a rainy October morning, 28-year-old Ethan Carter unlocked the front door of the small house he had inherited from his grandfather. The house hadn't been lived in for nearly 5 years. Dust covered the wooden floors. The grandfather clock had stopped ticking. The air carried the familiar scent of old books and cedar wood. Ethan wasn't there to relive memories. He planned to sell the property. After all, there was nothing left inside except old furniture and forgotten photographs. Or so he thought. While sorting through a dusty desk in the attic, he noticed a small envelope tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Its paper had turned yellow with age. Across the front, written in faded black ink, were 4 simple words. For whoever finds this. There was no stamp, no address, no date. Curious, Ethan carefully opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant. It read, "If you are reading this, then I never returned. Please don't search for me. Instead, go to the old train station at exactly 8:17 on October 14th. Stand beside platform 3. Do not be late. Everything will finally make sense." There was no signature, nothing else, just those words. Ethan laughed quietly. Someone had probably written it decades ago, a forgotten family joke. But one detail made him pause. The date, October 14th, tomorrow. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about the letter. Why hide it beneath the floor? Why not throw it away? Why did it feel as though someone had expected it to be found many years later? Curiosity has a strange way of growing. The more Ethan tried to ignore the letter, the more impossible it became. The next evening, at exactly 8:10, he parked outside Ashwood's abandoned railway station. The building had closed nearly 20 years earlier. Broken windows, rusted tracks, faded signs. Nature had slowly reclaimed everything. No trains stopped there anymore. At least, that's what everyone believed. Ethan walked toward platform 3. His footsteps echoed through the empty station. There wasn't another person in sight. He checked his watch. 8:16. The wind suddenly stopped. Everything became strangely quiet. Then, far in the distance, he heard it. A train whistle. Impossible. These tracks had been abandoned for decades, yet the sound grew louder. The rails beneath his feet began to vibrate. A faint light appeared through the darkness. Slowly, an old passenger train emerged from the fog. It looked untouched by time. Polished brass, glowing lanterns, steam drifting into the cold night air. The train rolled silently into the station. Its doors opened. Not a single passenger stepped out. Only one elderly conductor stood inside. He smiled. "I've been waiting." Ethan stared in disbelief. "What is this?" The conductor simply held out another envelope. The next letter. Before Ethan could ask another question, the doors closed. The train slowly disappeared back into the fog. Seconds later, it was gone. The tracks fell silent once again, as though nothing had happened. Shaking, Ethan opened the second envelope. Inside was another handwritten letter. "If you've received this, then you chose curiosity over fear. Good. You're exactly like I was." Ethan frowned. The handwriting looked familiar, very familiar. He compared it with the first letter. They matched perfectly. Then he noticed something impossible. At the bottom was a signature, Ethan Carter, his own name. His hands began trembling. "This isn't possible." He turned the page over. On the back, another sentence. "Don't worry, you won't believe it either. I didn't." For the next several weeks, Ethan searched everywhere. Library archives, town records, old newspapers. No mention of mysterious trains, no missing conductors, nothing. Eventually, he found one tiny newspaper article from 1968. A freight train had mysteriously disappeared during a heavy fog. Crew members claimed they saw lights on the tracks before losing radio contact. The investigation found nothing. No wreckage, no explanation. The article ended with one sentence. "The railway remains one of Ashwood's greatest unsolved mysteries." Months passed. Ethan almost convinced himself it had all been a dream. Then another letter arrived. This time, inside his own mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Same place, next year, 8/17. That was all. Against every instinct, he returned. The station looked exactly the same. At precisely 8:17, the train appeared once more. The same conductor, the same smile. This time, he invited Ethan aboard. The inside looked untouched by time. Passengers quietly read newspapers dated decades earlier. Some wore clothing from the 1950s, others from the 1970s. None of them spoke. At the very last seat, someone was waiting. A man in his early 60s. Gray hair, tired eyes. He looked strangely familiar. The man smiled softly. "You finally came." Ethan sat across from him. "Who are you?" The old man looked out the window before answering. "I'm you." Silence filled the carriage. Ethan laughed nervously. "No. You don't have to believe me." The older man reached into his coat and removed a photograph. It showed Ethan as a child, standing beside his grandfather, a picture that had never existed anywhere else. Only family members could have known it. Ethan's smile disappeared. The older Ethan explained that decades earlier, he had boarded the same mysterious train, believing it would reveal a secret. Instead, the train never returned him to the same timeline. It wandered through forgotten moments, places that no longer existed. Years passed differently aboard the train, sometimes weeks, sometimes decades. He had spent an entire lifetime trying to find a way back. I couldn't, so I wrote letters. I hid them where only I would find them. You were always my only chance. The younger Ethan whispered, "What do I do?" The older version smiled sadly. "Leave. Don't become me. You still have time." He handed over one final envelope. "This is the last letter." Before Ethan could respond, the train suddenly slowed. The conductor opened the door. "Yours stop." The older Ethan remained seated. He nodded once. "Go." Ethan stepped onto the platform. The doors closed. The train disappeared into the fog. Forever. Back home. Ethan waited until sunrise before opening the final envelope. Inside was a single sentence. "The greatest mystery isn't time. It's the choices we make before it changes us." There were no more letters, no mysterious trains, no unexplained whistles in the night. The abandoned station was demolished 2 years later. Nothing remained except empty ground. Yet every October 14th, at exactly 8:17 p.m., people living near the old railway line still claim they hear a distant train whistle echoing through the fog. And if you stand quietly, you might notice something else. An old envelope resting beside the tracks, waiting for the next curious stranger. Because some journeys don't begin with a ticket, they begin with a letter that was never supposed to arrive. The end. The 3:33 a.m. call, an original mystery story. Some people say every night has a quiet moment, a moment when the world seems to stop breathing. For most people, that moment passes unnoticed. But for Daniel Harper, it always arrived at exactly 3:33 a.m. Daniel had never believed in ghost stories. He was 29 years old, worked as a freelance photographer, and lived alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of Portland. His life was simple. Wake up, work, come home, sleep. Nothing unusual, nothing mysterious. Until the phone rang. The first call came on a cold November night. Daniel glanced at the clock beside his bed. 3:33 a.m. Unknown number. Half asleep, he answered. "Hello?" Silence. Not complete silence. There was breathing, slow, steady, almost as if someone stood only inches away. "Who's this?" No reply. Then the line disconnected. Daniel shrugged. Probably a prank. He went back to sleep. The next night, it happened again. 3:33 a.m. The same number, the same breathing. This time, something else. A faint sound, almost like rain. And somewhere in the distance, a train whistle. Daniel spoke louder. "If this is a joke, stop calling me." Click. The call ended. 3 nights later, the phone rang again. 3:33. Daniel didn't hesitate. He answered immediately. This time, a whisper. So quiet, he almost missed it. "Don't be late." Then, nothing. The call ended. Daniel replayed the words in his head all morning. Don't be late. Late for what? There was no meeting, no appointment, nothing important. By lunchtime, he had almost forgotten about it. The following night, the phone rang again. 3:33. Daniel answered. The whisper returned. The bridge. Then the line went dead. Just 2 words. The bridge. Portland had dozens of bridges. Which one? Why? Curiosity slowly became obsession. Daniel checked his phone records. No incoming number appeared. He contacted his service provider. They found nothing. According to their records, the calls had never happened. His phone showed no evidence, no missed calls, no recordings, nothing. It was as if someone had reached him without using the phone network at all. A week later, another call. 3:33. This time, the whisper sounded frightened. Hurry! Daniel couldn't ignore it anymore. He grabbed his coat, his camera, his car keys. Outside, heavy rain covered the city. He drove through empty streets with only one destination in mind. The oldest bridge in Portland, the Steel Bridge. As he arrived, he noticed flashing police lights. Traffic had stopped. An accident. A delivery truck had crashed through the guardrail only minutes earlier. Daniel parked nearby. A police officer told him, "You picked a bad night." Daniel stared at the twisted metal. If he had driven across the bridge 10 minutes earlier, he would have been directly in the truck's path. His hands began shaking. The phone call hadn't brought him into danger. It had kept him away from it, from that night forward. Daniel stopped fearing the calls. Instead, he waited for them every night. 3:33. Each message was short. Take the next exit. Stay inside. Turn around. Leave now. At first, they seemed meaningless until every single one proved correct. One warning helped him avoid a massive highway pileup. Another prevented him from entering a cafe moments before a gas explosion nearby. A third led him away from a hiking trail just before a dangerous landslide. Again and again, the mysterious caller seemed to know the future. Daniel's life slowly changed. He trusted the voice more than his own instincts. Friends noticed. You've become paranoid. His sister laughed whenever he canceled plans at the last minute. His co-workers joked about his magic phone. Daniel never explained. Who would believe him? Months passed. Then one night, the pattern changed. 3:33. The phone rang. Daniel answered. No breathing, no whisper, only one sentence. It's almost time. For the first time, the voice sounded familiar, very familiar, but Daniel couldn't place it. The next evening, the phone didn't ring. Neither did the night after. 3 nights passed. Silence. Daniel almost missed the calls. Then, on the 4th night, 3:33, the phone rang again. He answered instantly. The voice spoke clearly. Tomorrow. That's all. Tomorrow. The following day. Daniel received an email from a newspaper, a freelance photography assignment, a large abandoned factory outside the city. Payment was excellent. He accepted immediately. Late that afternoon, he arrived. The building looked unstable. Broken windows, collapsed walls, rust covered everything. Still, it offered incredible photographs. Daniel spent nearly an hour exploring. Then, his phone vibrated. 3:33 p.m., not a.m. p.m. Unknown number. He answered. The voice shouted, "Run!" The floor beneath him cracked. Concrete collapsed. Daniel jumped backward just as an entire section of the building crashed into the basement below. Dust filled the air. His heart pounded. He had escaped by seconds. Outside, he stared at his phone. The screen suddenly lit up. Incoming video call. Unknown number. Daniel answered. The screen showed himself. Older, gray hair, scars across his forehead. The older man looked exhausted. "You finally picked up." Daniel couldn't breathe. "What? Who are you?" The older version smiled sadly. "I'm you." The older Daniel explained everything. Years in the future, an experiment involving quantum communications had briefly connected two different points in time, only for seconds each day. Exactly. 3:33. The older Daniel had survived countless tragedies, but only after losing everyone he loved. He had spent years searching for a way to change the past. The phone calls were his only chance. "I can't save everyone. I can only save you." Daniel stared silently. "So everything, the bridge, the highway, the explosion, you?" The older Daniel nodded. "I lived through all of them. I wanted you to choose differently. But why now?" The older Daniel looked away. "Because this is the last call. The connection is collapsing. You won't hear from me again." Daniel felt an unexpected sadness. "You saved my life." The older version smiled. "No, you saved mine." Before Daniel could ask another question, the image began breaking apart. Static filled the screen. The connection faded. The final words barely came through. "Live the life." "I couldn't." The call ended forever. Years passed. Daniel never again received another phone call at 3:33. He married, started a family, continued photographing the world. Sometimes, late at night, he still woke automatically. 3:33. His phone remained silent, but he always smiled, because somewhere, perhaps in another future, another version of himself had sacrificed everything to give him a second chance. Today, Daniel still owns that old phone. It no longer turns on. Its battery died years ago, yet every November, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the screen briefly lights up. No ringtone, no message, just a single line. Connection lost. No one has ever been able to explain it. Technicians found nothing unusual. The phone contains no SIM card, no battery, no power source, and yet, once every year, it wakes for exactly 3 seconds, just long enough to remind Daniel that sometimes the most important call you'll ever receive comes from someone who already knows how your story ends. The end.